As these Sundays that I have with you are winding down, I've been thinking about what are the topics that I want to preach about with the time that I have left. And one of the things that I have returned to in my thinking is the question of love and what it means in Unitarian Universalism. A few weeks ago, David Jackaway preached to you about the current proposal to reimagine our 7 principles as values with love at the center of who we are and what we do. The Universalist strand of our theology and our history says that every person is worthy of love, held in love, we are all connected in love. UUA presidential candidate Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt says Unitarian Universalism has a love ethic that is the foundation of a liberal and liberating faith. And the question that you have raised many times over the last several years is a question much on your heart is, what does that mean? How do I hold all people as worthy of love? How do I practice an ethic of love when there are so many people in this country I am currently very angry at? What does it mean to practice love my neighbor when there is so much conflict in our community? Because there's so much conflict right now, right? We're so polarized as a nation across so many dimensions of our lives, on so many issues, from the very top level of squabbling Congress people all the way down to the local level, the level of our own communities. There was a story on CNN.com yesterday, arrived fortuitously, by Elle Reeve and Samantha Guff, titled, this title caught my attention, "Activist Moms Spy on Each Other in Culture Wars Over Schooling." And the story was about how there are these sort of national moms groups, that's what they call themselves, that organize chapters in local communities to strategize on how to push for their agendas with local school boards. So Moms for Liberty is a well-known example on the far right. And then these groups provoke other local groups to counter-organize, like a group in Colorado called Neighbors for Education. That's where this story comes out of. And according to CNN, when these groups get together on the internet, or even like if they go out to the local Mexican restaurant to chat, members of the other side will infiltrate their meetings to spy on each other and record videos of each other and then post these things on the internet and just generally disrupt what each other are doing. And these are highly polarized groups. A Moms for Liberty chapter leader in Colorado Springs believes there is a coordinated effort to deliberately undermine the family structure in America being carried out by school teachers and school nurses. A Neighbors for Education representative was quoted as saying the other group was living in an alternate reality. There's not a lot of dialogue going on between these two. There's not a lot of love lost between them. So there's been a book that's been on my radar for a while as a possible sermon topic because of this question of what does the love ethic mean in practice? How do I love my neighbor when I think they are actually doing terrible things in my community and we live in 2 different realities? The book is called A See No Stranger by Valarie Kaur, and it is about this question. So Valarie Kaur, if you don't know, is a lawyer, an author, an activist. She now leads a project she calls the Revolutionary Love Project. It is grounded in her Sikh faith and inspired by the writings and works of many authors and activists who have promoted a revolutionary love ethic in the last century. So Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Adrienne Mary Brown, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and more. She has a TED Talk that's been viewed millions and millions of times that you can watch online if you want the brief introduction to her ideas. It's about 20 minutes long. Valarie Kaur grew up in a Sikh community in California. Sikhism is a world religion most practiced in the Punjab region of India, but today there are Sikhs all around the world, including 500,000 in America and about 10,000 here in Indiana. Note the religion is pronounced Sikh, spelled S-I-K-H. You will often hear the Americanized pronunciation, which is Sikh. So you may hear either of those pronunciations. The Sikh faith arose in the 15th century in India during a time when there was really terrible religious violence between Muslims and Hindus. And the founder of the faith, who is now known as Guru Nanak, was someone who had an ecstatic vision of God's oneness while he was praying by the local river, and he was lost in this vision for days. He disappeared for 3 days. Everyone had thought he had drowned. When he reappeared to the people, his first words reportedly were, "There is no Muslim, there is no Hindu." And his teachings emphasized the oneness of the divine in all of us, such that all people are worthy, all people are interconnected. And this led to an ethic of equality and love and service. The fifth Sikh teacher, Guru Arjan, captured his central insight in a song. The words are, "I see no stranger, I see no enemy, all of us belong to each other." We can hear echoes of this in our own UU tradition and principles, especially the seventh principle of our interdependence in the web of life. On September 15th, 2001, a Sikh man named Balbir Singh Sodhi was killed in Arizona in a hate crime in retaliation for the September 11 attacks. The man who shot him 5 times in the back believed that he was a Muslim. He had set out that evening with the intent to kill some people that he thought looked like the enemies he saw attacking us on TV. He shot Mr. Sodhi because he wore a turban. This was the first of multiple random attacks all around the country carried about against Sikhs, against Muslims, Middle Easterners, members of the Asian community in the aftermath of 9/11. And Balbir Singh Sodhi was a friend of Valarie Kaur's family, and she was shaken by his murder. And she was a documentary filmmaker in college at the time, so she and her cousin, just like immediately, they jumped in a Honda Civic, and they spent months driving around the country from city to city, from coast to coast, sleeping on couches, doing whatever they could. And they were following the scene to hate crimes and then interviewing the victims and their families so that the stories of these communities could be told, because they were not making the nightly news at that time. And the eventual result of all of this work was an award-winning 2008 documentary called "Divided We Fall: America in the Aftermath," that told the story of hate crimes in America post 9/11. And Kaur and her director began holding screenings and community discussions of the film starting in 2006. And what she discovered is that when they shared these stories of these Sikh victims, when the stories were told of their own pain and oppression, they connected with the people in the audience who began to connect their own stories of pain or oppression with what was going on in the Sikh community. So, for example, a Japanese person stood up and shared about the grandparents' experience in the internment camps. A gay person shared about being harassed for being LGBTQ. A black person in the audience said, "My dreadlocks are my turban." Kaur said, "We made the film so that others would listen to our stories. We did not expect that we were making space for us to listen to their stories. But I understood that the pain that I had felt to be so uniquely my own belonged to many." And she became convinced that listening to each other's stories is one of the central practices of what she calls revolutionary love. She says, deep listening is an act of surrender. We risk being changed by what we hear. But of course, it is relatively easy to listen to people who we already know and trust, who are familiar to us, who share our worldview, or who we think are on our side. It is a lot harder to listen to those people who we view as our opponents, those people who we think may intend us harm. And Kaur says she prefers the word opponent to enemy, because in her mind, the word enemy suggests a fixed category, something permanent. The word opponent is fluid. It means we are in opposition now about this thing, but not all things. We don't have to be opposed forever. But she is also real about the stakes, right? Our opponents can mean real harm to us, our families, our communities. They can threaten violence, discrimination, dehumanization. They can hurt us. As a young filmmaker documenting a protest against the Iraq War in New York City, this was 2004, Kaur was swept up in a mass arrest and handcuffed with plastic handcuffs and thrown in the back of a van before she could even explain that she was press. She was a legal observer. She was taken to a detention center. By the time she got there, she had no feeling in her hands. She explained that the cuffs were cutting off her circulation. The police officer physically abused her at that point, and the result of the abuse was chronic pain and the loss of the use of one of her arms that persisted for more than a year. And of course, this was minor, right? Others have suffered much, much worse. Kaur decided that she was going to devote her life to defending people from that much, much worse. So from filmmaking, she went to become a lawyer and a civil rights activist. Her work took her to Guantanamo Bay and the prisoners of war there, took her to a Latino community that was being terrorized by an abusive and racist police force, took her inside supermax prisons where people are routinely held in solitary confinement 23 hours a day for periods that are considered far beyond safe. She observed systems where abuse was normalized. People participated in it as a part of their everyday lives. They even joked about it. And as part of her work and part of her revolutionary love practice, she interviewed the prison guards and interviewed the police, trying to understand how the world looked from their perspective. She talked to the young soldier at Guantanamo who bitterly complained that the prisoners were freer than he was from his perspective. She talked to police who were incentivized by the system they were embedded in to target immigrants. She talked to prison guards at supermax prisons who came to hate the prisoners, but love their fellow prison guards as brothers in arms who had each other's backs. And they felt that even as they watched one another succumb over years to alcoholism, to depression, to broken relationships, as participation in this dehumanizing system slowly robbed everyone of their humanity, not just the prisoners. And she was challenged by this to see the fear and the pain in the stories of those who she also saw as persecutors, including the officer who had abused her. She was challenged to see how everyone suffers from hate, how participation in oppression disconnects people from their own capacity for love. And she was able to see the systems that magnified this pain and empowered that abuse. She began to imagine a revolutionary love rooted in wonder about our opponents that frees us from hate and empowers us to act. Kaur writes, "It's easy to wonder about the internal life of the people closest to us. It is harder to wonder about people who seem like strangers or outsiders. But when we choose to wonder about people we don't know, when we imagine their lives and listen for their stories, we begin to expand the circle of who we see as a part of us." And so Kaur said she makes it a practice when she rides on the subway to look at the strangers around her and think brother, uncle, daughter, sibling, challenging herself to see each person beyond whatever other prejudices or associations or assumptions that she might have, reminding herself that every person she sees has a story, has a family, is embedded in a sea of humanity. And she returns to the grounding of her Sikh faith, which mirrors the fundamental teachings of all the world's religions, calling on us to expand the circle of who belongs and who is worthy of care. I see no stranger, I see no enemy, all of us belong to each other. If you choose to see no stranger, she says, then you must wonder about them even when they do not wonder about you. You must care for them even when they do not care for you. She says to greet the other with the thought, you are a part of me that I don't yet know. And then be curious about their story, how they got to be where they are, why they think the way they do, what pain might be underneath their anger or fear or hate, what communities might be enabling or empowering them. And for Kaur, to be really clear, this is not about the idea that everyone is equally right. When we listen to people, she says, we do not give them legitimacy. We listen to understand. And challenging the other person's worldview is part of listening to each other. even as we also must be open to the idea that our own view could change. Listening is not about placating. It's not about comforting the person we're talking to. It's not about making friends or making nice. It's about understanding, increasing our mutual understanding. She points out the rush to feel polite, to emphasize the sameness and paper over our differences, to steer clear of discomfort or naming hard truths. This does not serve the cause of understanding. Revolutionary love is also not about the idea that others matter more than we do, or that we are supposed to be selfless. She says that revolutionary love must be grounded in self-love first, or else, in fact, it becomes a form of self-hatred, a denial that we matter. We have a right to assert our self-worth and to protect ourselves. She says, loving our opponents requires us to love ourselves. She says, Gandhi, King, Mandela, they taught a lot about how to love others and opponents. They didn't talk about loving ourselves. She says, this is a feminist intervention. And she points to thinkers like Bell Hooks and Adrienne Marie Brown for this intervention, that the work must be rooted in self-love to be healthy and indeed effective. She says revolutionary love is not about denying anger. In fact, she says it is important for us to have safe spaces to access our rage, because we should feel anger when others harm or threaten us. Our anger tells us that we matter. It tells us what we care about enough to fight for. It gives us energy to fight. She quotes Audre Lorde, anger is loaded with information and energy. She says, for example, every woman has a well-stocked arsenal of anger, potentially useful against personal and institutional oppressions. Focused with precision, it can become a powerful source of energy, serving progress and change. And indeed, in her own life, in the story she tells of recovering from the wound that the police officer gave her that lasted for well over a year, healing did not begin until she was finally able to admit the rage that she felt about that incident, which she was suppressing as someone who did not associate that kind of rage with love. When she accessed the rage and could allow it, healing became possible. Kaur says we should choose to listen for two reasons. We should choose to listen for two reasons. First, listening is strategic. We listen so we can understand, so we can do justice work better. We listen so we can understand, so we can be a part of the changing of the world. She says, it is hard work and not very effective to just focus on a few bad actors as though they are a few bad actors. When we listen, we begin to understand the larger systems that we are embedded in that are radicalizing and empowering those bad actors, and then we can work together to change those systems. One of the reasons she became a lawyer, to change the systems. The other reason we listen, she says, is out of self-love. We listen to understand, to see the pain and humanity underneath the harm, so we can release ourselves from hate. She says, the more I listen, the less I hate. The less I hate, the more I am free to choose actions that are controlled not by animosity, but by wisdom. She says, laboring to love my opponents is how I love myself. This is not the stuff of saintliness. This is our birthright. She says, I do not owe my opponents my affection, my warmth, my regard, but I do owe myself a chance to live in this world without the burden of hate. She tells a story of how after Balbir Singh Sodhi's murder, she met with his widow as a part of her documentary and asked her, what would you like to tell the people of America? She remembers, I was expecting blame and bitterness, but his widow looked at me and said, tell the people of America, thank you. 3,000 Americans came to my husband's memorial, she said. They did not know me, but they wept with me. Tell them thank you. Thousands of people showed up because unlike the national news, the local media told his story. Stories can create the wonder that turns strangers into siblings. 15 years after that murder, Kaur and Mr. Singh Sodhi's brother, Rana, called the man who killed him, a man named Frank Roque, who is now sentenced to life in prison. He agreed to speak with them, and on the call, Frank expressed remorse, but initially he failed to take responsibility for the act, blaming 9/11, blaming what he called a mental breakdown. Rana pressed on anyway, wondering about him, and said, "This is the first time I've heard you say that you're sorry." And Frank said, "Yes, I am sorry for what I did to your brother. One day when I go to heaven to be judged by God, I will ask to see your brother, and I will hug him, and I will ask him for forgiveness." And Rana answered the man, "We already forgave you." I want to close with this prayer. Spirit of life and love, in this conflicted, polarized time that we live in, we pray first that all people be kept safe. We give thanks for our anger that tells us that we are worthy and motivates us to confront injustice. We give thanks for the possibility of forgiveness that frees us from hate. May we risk to see no stranger in the people we meet, wondering at our common humanity, lamenting our common hurts, and opening ourselves to the possibility of transformation and reconciliation. We seek this not as a substitute for doing the work of justice, but as an act of revolutionary love that is part and parcel of the work of justice. May we all do what we can, as we can, to become a part of the healing of our world. Amen.